As retailers entered the lockdown in March 2020, a small, diverse group of Canadian thought leaders gathered to virtually speculate, collaborate, and share their insights on the waves of disruption facing retailers. The Business of Retail podcast emerged as an unflinching strategic alternative to the conventional discourse, revealing challenges in the headlines and exploring new, unconventional paths for all facets of the retail industry. Now, here's the panel.
Welcome, everyone, to our latest podcast episode in the ongoing discourse that is the business of retail. And I've had a few people mention to me that they know who I am in my network. Who are these other characters that are on with you? And I think that's actually the value I get out of this is the diversity around the discussion. So I'm going to do a little bit more than introduce names today. I'll throw a little tagline on each person. So we've got Craig Patterson, who, if you're in Canadian retail, you should know who Craig is, but not to make you feel too guilty, I'll let you know. He's the founder and editor-in-chief of Retail Insider, which is arguably the most go-to and well-read Canadian retail news publication today. We have Gary Newbury, who is a supply chain expert, and he, in addition to consultative work, he is a contracted in senior executive on supply chain transformation initiatives, with a lot of work in retail and distribution. Christine Cowan, expat Canadian, but down in Portland, Oregon, has had a stellar career on the brand side of things, on marketing, merch, and innovation with two of the world's icons, Nike and Adidas. And George Minikakis is our resident CEO, having held that role in different countries around the world with LensCrafters and Luxottica brands. And George does a lot of work these days with private equity and different ventures, some of which now and again he shares with us, and other times he does not. Today, we have a very special guest and someone I've followed from afar for a long time. Christine Day, who in the heavy growth period of Lululemon, passing along from the founder, Chip Wilson, Christine had quite a ride and really built Lulu into the platform that you see it operating at today. But Christine has done a lot more than that. Prior to that, she helped grow Starbucks globally. But a lot's been happening since then. And Christine, we'll get you to tell us a little bit about that and our listeners. Today's episode, though, is something that I have been interested in for years, and more so every year. And that is the rise and proliferation of young brands. A lot of them are in fashion and lifestyle type products, but more and more we're seeing those arrive as digital natives in many cases. And we want to discuss today just the rise of young brands and how it's rare that some really succeed and become quite scaled, but the ones that do, how do they do that? And what are the barriers to the success? And what are the patterns that we're seeing? And there is no better person to join us today than Christine Day. So Christine, welcome. And why don't you catch us up a little bit? Tell us a little bit about what you've been up to since the days of Lulu.
Thank you, David. Pleasure to be here, and especially with such a stellar group of retail passionate people like myself. So it's always great to be in good company. So since I left Lulu, I acquired and played a leading role in building what ultimately became Performance Kitchen, which is a food as medicine concept, which is across many channels in grocery, retail stores, store-in-stores, in grocery stores, food service. But really the big win there, and what we were working on was food for people with, that tasted great, but was for diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, and getting it to the point where the dietary background actually was able to be put into the insurance system as food as medicine. And so then ultimately winning contracts where, particularly in the US, where people are on Medicare or Medicaid, they actually get food as a benefit. So that just recently happened. We won our first contracts. We have over 100 diagnostic codes for food as medicine. Toughest business I've ever been in, making the margins work in food so hard. It took everything my team and I had and every bit of capital we ever raised, and it probably brought me to my knees a couple of times in all of that to get there. But so really proud of the fact that we accomplished that. Proud that a new CEO just stepped in to kind of take it to the next level now that a lot of the kind of concept work's done. So over the last year, I started building and getting back into the fashion world. So I partnered up with the Seattle Seahawks quarterback Russell Wilson and his wife Sierra, and we've created a house of brands. And so there's a men's concept called the Good Man brand. There's a Gen Z, gender fluid, sustainable concept called Human Nation. And this fall we'll be launching a women's concept. And we're already, two of them are already DTC, but we also do kind of a strategic wholesale model with those, with partners like Nordstrom's and Kohl's. So multi-channel, and it's really fun to be back in the apparel world. So much easier than food, but loving the kind of startup entrepreneurial space. And in that new concept, we're doing a lot. We've assembled an expert team, but the whole sustainability model and really raising the bar in fashion, which sits quite low, is very important and part of our concept. And then really this whole new, what we're calling direct to consumer, we're calling it direct to community 3.0. So really taking community digital to the next level is a key part of what we're working on.
Well, I think that's timely for us that you're joining us with that initiative going on, if we're going to be talking about the scaling of young brands. I think a lot of the ones that we encounter don't have the good fortune of having someone like you alongside, Christine, but they're often probably at the same point in their journey that you arrived at when you joined in. And why don't we start? As I said, I've been interested in this for a long time. I feel like, and I want you guys to validate this for me, but I feel like even though we're seeing a demise of fashion sales globally, we're seeing more and more native young fashion brands, lifestyle brands popping up monthly almost, it feels like, in the last few years with a lot of passion. And there does seem to be a sense of purpose along it. And obviously, Christine, with your background, even at Lulu, scaling something, not just selling, but selling a concept, there seems to be a desire to do that. But I'm wondering, are we seeing that? Am I seeing that correctly? And if so, why is that? What's behind this shift of the last 5-10 years?
Well, I think you've got several things happening in the marketplace. One is just the whole rise of the influencer model, and really that whole community that's being created, and particularly the rise of the celebrity model on top of that, and the gap in the marketplace that we see around particularly sustainability. So if you look at the success of a lot of these small brands, whether it's Pangaea, which got to 75 million in 4 years by really focusing on sustainability, Everlane. So I think there's some common themes here about reinventing fashion in a more sustainable way and tied together in this whole digital world with influencers. The trick, as we all know, is not just having an idea about a product or a concept, but it's actually scaling it into a profitable business model. and I think that's going to be the challenge for a lot of these young brands. I think we're seeing a rise in entrepreneurialism, in this Gen Z millennial set, where people want to start their own companies, be their own boss, whether even if it's just selling at a local community level, and then with the dreams of becoming a bigger. And I actually am really excited about that. And I actually think the pandemic and COVID situation has accelerated those dreams and some of those opportunities.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I love what you said about the sense of community too, because I think community-based businesses and the social purpose thing is really, really important right now, especially to the new generations like Gen Z. And I think just that ability to be more transparent. I think we're seeing a lot of fashion brands talking about it and talking about sustainability, but they're not really walking the walk. So we're seeing, the business of fashion and other larger organizations looking at ways to start tracking that and giving more transparency to consumers, which I think, is really key. But I agree. I think there's a lot happening. It's easier for entry for younger brands now more than ever with the COVID situation, and real estate prices are dropping. And so things that might've been prohibitive before are now a real opportunity for young brands to get into. And there's a lot of, especially in Portland, we have a lot of young brands that really are supportive of each other. So there are a lot of young founders who are looking to each other for guidance and help and are supporting each other and being less separated and I'm going to go my own way, which is also really great because I think the collaboration just brings out so much opportunity for these younger brands.
I don't think that's traditionally a strong point of retail either. I think the old school founder model was we're going to stay in our bubble. We're different from everyone else, and the only way to ensure that is to not to talk to anyone else. So there's another element though that I think, and maybe Gary can weigh in on this, is if we go back further, you might start a brand, but how do you distribute it? And I think not just the online model to sell, but the distribution side and coming from supply chain, drop ship must be a big impact on the rise of these brands too, right, Gary?
Yeah, if you mean drop ship, that I take the order, I create the interest, I take the order and I pass it to somebody else to organize the fulfillment. That actually is an incredibly easy model to operate, as long as you're working with partners who understand what you're trying to achieve in the marketplace and mirror that in their delivery proposition. But I think one of the differences between, say, 2000, when there was an explosion in great new concepts, lots of young people getting involved in, taking money from the peers and burning it at a great rate of knots and crashing into the x-axis really fast, is that the internet's much more, settled. It's a much more not easier, that's probably the wrong word, but a more easy way of addressing a very big marketplace. Back in the day, before the internet altogether, that a business would just be faced with a physicality of their area. So it's as far as they could almost see, whereas on the internet, you can see the whole globe. I think to the point that Christine Day made about the influencer model, that I try to think about those as direct sellers. People representing your brand or could represent your brand if the planets align. I think there's a number of things out there now which haven't been out there, and even at particular points in our development as retail, it's kind of like the planets are starting to align and things are possible. Now, I spoke recently to somebody from Ryerson. Craig kindly invited me to do a speaker appointment, and the most harrowing, impressive, or my endearing thing I took away was they're absolutely obsessed with sustainability.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah.
And people of a certain age group, I'm looking around the room and I'm seeing quite a few of them. Perhaps that wasn't sort of so inbuilt into the business models we got brought up on. And so the big challenge is how do we apply our business thinking to a more sustainable business model, and what the things that might need to change in our whole way of looking at things to make sustainability much further up the pecking order than it has been in the past.
Well, George, I think that's a great point, and I think we have to tackle fast fashion with that. You know, some stats out of a London report that I was looking at recently. Basically, if Zara, H&M, and Target, reduce their carbon emissions in the way that they manufacture by 30%, it would have the biggest impact in changing the footprint that fashion has on the world. Those entry price point brands hold 43% of the global market share, and the mid price point brands hold 47%. And in sustainability, it can be pricey, and we're seeing, certain brands at the high end, like maybe, Gani said, they're only 10% of the market. So what we have to do is create sustainable brands at affordable price points and stop this disposable clothing marketplace that we have. And that's going to change sustainability as much as using all the great fabric technologies that we're seeing today, that making it so much more possible to create garments that out of recycled fabrics or the whole organic cotton movement. So it takes technical expertise to solve this problem, but it also is about creating affordable products to get after some of these, behemoths that actually have so many bad practices in the way that they bring products to market.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the transparency piece is now more than ever, like, really critical. And I think there's some really amazing designers like Stella McCartney, where she's always been a real fan of that and doesn't, uses vegan leathers, et cetera. And then she's also now using excess materials. That's another big, issue in the apparel world, is all the excess and the waste from that. So repurposing, trying to get more circular with that as well, is another big opportunity. It's tough. I mean, I think one thing that I think is really good is their brands are starting to make their senior leaders accountable. So it's their bottom line, and their compensation is based on that. And, unfortunately, I think it's great talk, but the more you kind of put things like that in place to kind of force leadership in some of these larger organizations to be accountable for it, I think that's also going to really help the model. But you're right. I mean, the fashion world, and especially fast fashion, there's a bit of a backlash, I think, with that too. And people are starting to look at, reusing bags and apparel and things like that, or buying products that are really great quality that a consumer can have for a long time. And, less about the fast fashion and the wastefulness of that, and more around what great product can I buy that's going to have a great lifetime for me, and that's built properly. Everlane's a great example of that, where it's fully transparent and you understand and you see. And there's some companies out there too offering up and saying, what would you be willing to pay for something? And it might be a little bit more. But the biggest challenge is the cost factor in creating these products and doing all the sustainable methods, because it comes at a cost. And then that is the challenge to consumers.
Well, and especially Christine Cowan, we have two Christines today. Going back to Gary's point, if we're talking about very young brands, where there's a millennial passionate founder who wants to break up that model and reinvent it, even what you're talking about is sort of at a level of sophistication and capitalization that they may not have. So when I look at this, I see almost a Darwinian soup of all these efforts going on, and every now and again something just catches. But what's interesting is what made that catch. And if we take away the fact that there could be a market relevance, I think on the other side of it is, at the end of the day, as Christine Day said, it has to be affordable, whatever they're doing, but also has to be good quality. It has to be good design. It also has to be profitable for the business. And when you start getting into that, the encounters I've had often are lacking in one or more of those, even though the intentions are great. So what's the next level? Where does this start to go once they're jumping into the market and selling for a while, and suddenly maybe they're plateauing and it's not going further?
Well, I think, David, you're right. And there's one other challenge with that. Let's take organic cotton. A lot of small little brands, leapt on that, started creating organic cotton, products. But now 51.9% of companies are all of a sudden chasing organic cotton. So now what happens to that small person who maybe can't buy futures in cotton and pre-buy because they're too small and just don't have the capital or leverage to do that? So what I'm seeing happening to a lot of these young brands is they're getting priced out. It could leap up almost 30% right now for organic cotton purchases. And so that could destroy a young brand's, capital and margins right at the point maybe they're trying to raise capital. And so that's one of the things that I see happening often in the supply chain when somebody is maybe innovative. If you don't have your funding lined up and all of a sudden cotton prices, is up and you maybe aren't a growth point, that's a real challenge for young brands and can really derail their growth story is access to that key fabric or technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really, really good point. It's a tough one because you have the bigger brands and the mass product and their ability to, secure factory space, to secure the quantities and the pricing based on the volume that they're doing. And then you've got these smaller, nimbler brands, and it's a challenge for them. It's a real shift. There's a really interesting brand here. It's a woman who's a kite surfer, and she's done kind of inclusive bathing suits and stuff. And so she gets actually off product from larger vendors like Janssen and other swimwear vendors, and then kind of creates her product around that. But there's a real challenge to that, even with creating something in terms of consistency or bringing the same styles back or colors or things like that. So it's a tough one for especially the material side of things.
I wonder how many companies there are out there that, now we know there are a lot of them that talk about the environment, they talk about sustainability. They've got some statement somewhere, but I came across an article probably 6-8 months ago that said the 3 words that corporations hate today are social purpose, the environment, and transparency. Right. So I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. Those are the 3 things that they're talking about, that they're all for and support, but at the same time, they hate the whole idea of having to be transparent and include it inside their governance, which is quite interesting. And Christine, I wonder, I don't know what percentage of companies out there, but I think this decade will probably expose a lot of, fake, if you will, or not substantiated efforts to really improve their own organizations around all those issues.
I think, it's what is the definition of good too, right? We used to have the give back model like Tom's shoes. Well, they came out today and said, only 30% of their shoes are sustainable. How do you compete against Allbirds? The giving model itself isn't enough. But, what is interesting, the bar is being raised. So also what's going to happen to these young brands, not only supply chain, but so, one of the other studies I came across recently said 42.6% of companies or brands now have a sustainability range. It could be 1 or 2 pieces. 40.7% reuse or recycle unsold stock, which is new. That, the whole dumping and destroying of stock that didn't sell was a big issue. And 12% now offer a take back scheme, and 53.7% use recycled materials. So we're starting to see some level of change in the industry that small young brands have really hung their hat on some of these promises. So what happens as the big players move into this space, not only in the supply chain, but I do think there's an acquisition opportunity. So like if young brands have created a story and that, so how do you get hooked up with those strategics and become that acquisition target at the right time in your cycle? Or else you do everything on a very local community level and you make that play where you're the go-to in your community. So, I think those are some of the challenges as the whole market does improve. What is the story these young brands can continue to differentiate in? And maybe it becomes a little bit like the Starbucks story where you have one big coffee shop and then everybody else is small independents in the marketplace. That would be, I think, a very positive outcome I could see happening in today's model where people want to buy from more local, small communities. And then, or else it could go the way of everybody gets acquired, which is what happens to small brands in the grocery model. And so, and so then they push them out, like Coca-Cola buys all these small brands, then pushes them out through their distribution network till they've kind of had their play. Then they buy the next one and do the same thing over and over again. So I think there's a couple of ways this could go for some of these small, companies. But I think having your head up around, what does that look like to grow and scale, and what are the challenges and risks of your business, is, I think, a great education topic for these young entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm.
I think you hit the nail on the head. I think that's the pivot point, is where an honest conversation is had, and maybe it's even within one's head. Do they have what it takes, and do they want to put the time and effort into scale? And Raymond Schulman, who works with us at Take 360, he's been mentoring some who he thinks are really fantastic young entrepreneurs, but a couple of them have no desire to scale beyond a lifestyle they've created for themselves. And you know what? Nothing wrong with that. I think we've got caught up in this idea that everything has to exponentially, grow and be the next Wayfair, the next whatever. But I think maybe as we move through our discussion today, I think we should pick apart that a little bit. If it is a founder who does want to scale up their brand and do more, and they're listening to this episode, maybe we can help them a little bit in terms of what to anticipate and where they're going to run into some roadblocks, and how to future-proof that and get ahead of it. And I'm sure, George, in your experience with investors, at some point that's going to be part of the dialogue, and there's a tendency to go for that money, and maybe it happens a bit too soon in some cases.
So there's two places that come to mind. One is I read an article, and it happened to be in Retail Insider. So there's a plug for you, Craig. And if you're not listening to TBOR, you can get on any podcast channel to listen to us too. So, but here's the point. There's this business that's gone into bankruptcy, apparel, and their comeback strategy is that because all other businesses are going to be failing, they're going to win in the marketplace. I thought, okay, that's quite interesting, a strategy. But what about all the young guns that are coming, right? All these entrepreneurs, because Christine, I like the fact that you mentioned about entrepreneurship, that I've read the same thing, and I've seen it. There's a lot of entrepreneurs who are people who have given up their day jobs because of the pandemic and are starting new businesses. They don't need the four walls to do this. There's a lot of other things they can do, and it's coming. So all I could think of was, where would I put my money today? Would it be with this one entrepreneur who's got a really unique opportunity that they're presenting in the marketplace that's a niche? Or would I go with this retailer who's come out of bankruptcy? They had 100 stores and now have 30, but they think they're going to make a big comeback because, everybody else is going to fail. Well, I'm not going with the guy that went bankrupt. I'm going to take my chances somewhere else. And I see that a lot. We had an earlier discussion about, coming to market and somebody getting $20-30 million in the first round and being 19 years old, right? That bankrupt business is not going to get $30 million to do the same thing. So I'd say, yes, these young guns that are coming up, and they're not all young, but these young opportunities that are coming are going to make a big difference. And because they also have a passion around sustainability, the environment, social purpose, how they help their communities, right? I mean, they all have their own little niche about why they're doing something. They're driven by it. And I believe the public is going to connect to that far quicker than to that 30-40 store chain that think they're going to come back after bankruptcy. So.
I'm seeing these brands in terms of with Retail Insider, a lot of these young brands and how they're forming quite often, like you were saying, young entrepreneurs that may have been in other businesses and may not be working there anymore. They've discovered things through social media. So now they're actually marketing themselves through social media quite often. And this in itself could be quite disruptive to established brands that haven't really mastered the new way that things are being done. I think that we're going to start to see some of these younger brands, they may be digitally native, actually seeing success even in a brick and mortar space as sort of, a multi-channel business and having that sustainability message. Again, this is one of those situations, I think, where these brands have watched what's actually happening and how consumers are actually getting information and are able to develop their brands accordingly. And I think that some of the old brands that are out there that have been in existence for many years aren't going to get it. They're basically going to be the dinosaurs that are going to fall eventually. And, I won't name names, but you can think of a lot of those women's stores you see in the suburban malls. I don't know what their future is going to be when you've got the young cool brands like Emmy DeVoe out of Edmonton, Le Monarch out of Vancouver. These are really interesting brands that are doing great things with design and have a sustainability bent and a charitable bent, and they're really engaging with their consumer base and are doing so in a fun, interesting way. And I don't know how, what the future of a brand like Reitman's is going to be in comparison, because they're not as, they're not engaging one-on-one with the consumer. And I don't think that they have that story to tell that some of these younger brands do.
Well, I'm going to tell you that I get excited talking to these entrepreneurs, even if the money's not there yet, much more than I better not say this because I'm going to lose some clients. But if you're a behemoth organization and you're just playing with things around the edges, but these guys are building and creating, and it's so fun to watch that. But I started with an observation, and I tested the waters with you to see, hey, are you seeing it too? Here's another one. The brands like you're describing, when you start online digital native, as soon as you flip on the website, and by the way, I think we're going through this with the podcast journey that we're on, you start getting some clicks, you start getting some likes, you get a couple of deals, people are buying from you. So you're going from zero, and almost overnight, you start to see a curve start to go up. So everyone's kind of excited, and they say, first of all, we'll never need a retail store. And we don't need to do wholesale. Look at the margins we've got. We'll just sell online forever. But what tends to happen is a plateau's reached. And that could be earlier or later, but there's always a plateau that's reached in that model. And then they say, if we're going to keep going, now we have to do something else. And it could be infrastructure, like they're getting too busy and they're all do it yourself. Or the market needs something to boost beyond the noise that's out there, and maybe they have to look at doing stores. Those are I've seen so many time and time again that I've observed kind of hit that wall, and then a year later they really haven't. They've actually regressed.
3 themes that I would definitely focus on. One is when that initial seed capital, when you take that 20 or $30 million, that's a lot of money. And what happens is oftentimes small businesses create a growth plan that meets the capital they get in, versus remembering they're in the business of creating desire and executing against, where their consumers at. So, all of a sudden, and I use this an example here of like Nasty Gal, they took the money in, now they had to meet the growth strategy. So all of a sudden they did, instead of 1 pair of shoes, they did 40 pair of shoes. They created, instead of buying vintage clothing and argument that, they created all these new categories. And what they did was they expanded beyond where their consumer saw them at way too rapidly. And then the next thing you know, they marked down all the product. They have no margin. They made mistakes in all the shoes. They didn't have the expertise in the team. They built a big building. They bought a distribution center because the growth plan said they need to have these many units. And the next thing you know, you've got a company in bankruptcy because it ran out of cash, and they hired all these people. So, it's really important not to grow to the money you get in, but to grow to the desire curve you can create with the consumers. And the second is you're moving from an entrepreneurial idea to creating a business model that requires another level of expertise, because you're going from kind of like doing and creating to planning for success in a more complex business as things scale. And so you need expertise. And it's really hard to change from an entrepreneurial to kind of a planning for success, particularly in founder-led, when the founder is the yes person, or they're the person who controls everything and has all the ideas, which you do need to set. But if you can't lay out strategies for people to execute against, without you making all the decisions, you paralyze your organization. And that's a factor, without bringing in that skill and those people that can help you do that, and listen to them. Because, there's a lot of value to managing risk, which also comes on, like, you look at some of the challenges that like Outdoor Voices had. Taylor's pretty, open in saying, I wasn't listening to managing the risk in the process. And I was too focused on my ideas, and I wasn't building the business model, and we ran out of money, and we stalled at, around a $30-40 million growth rate. And so how do you push through that? Hiring and a team that scales, and bringing in the experts, and sometimes sadly letting go of some of the people who haven't been able to grow with you. are, things that have to happen. You have to put in more process and structure. And for a lot of entrepreneurs, giving up decision-making rights and pushing execution down into your team, so you can stay on kind of strategy and vision and communication. And as a leader, you've got all of a sudden managed shareholders and what I call other people's money, OPM. You've got to create a business model now, not just a product. And those are difficult transitions, getting the right CFO, the right investment bankers who help you build the team, and creating a culture where you accept the experience. It's the hardest thing to do, is in managing those levers as a small business, and not being able to control everything, because young entrepreneurs sometimes don't have the skill to tell their story in a way that can become a strategy. And they only know how to do it by making all the decisions around it. And so getting through those in your personal development and developing your team are really important for young brands and companies to think about, and how you partner and get that expertise into the company through either your capital source or a board that you create is so important.
Christine, who would be the best kind of person to be a mentor to these young entrepreneurs? What's their background that makes it easy? Because obviously these entrepreneurs they're wild, they're crazy, they're building, and then a 50-something shows up and is going to tell them what's what, and they don't understand their concept to begin with. How do you bridge that?
It's tough, but I mean, I think, the first moves I made, because, Lulu was I think there were 3 people that had been in a public company before in the management team, right? Like it was the controller, the CFO, and 1 person in the supply chain. And everybody else was really green, and they'd been everybody from Chip's neighbors to, I think it's talented though. I mean, passionate about what they're doing, but you've got to have a great CFO. Because somebody who's managing your money, the books, whatever, managing your risks. And then, hiring a great merchant in the product architecture, because you can't just stuff ideas, and how your product story hangs together as you grow. It's not just about, I'm doing 10 more things that I like. It's how you grow key items and what your margins are, and then your supply chain. So if you're not managing your sourcing, production, where can you go to get minimums, having experts in those areas. I'd probably add one more, which is fabric technology if I was building an apparel company. And then a retail operator who's really good. And you have to pick where your experience and passion is as a leader. And that's where you can spend more time. But everything else, you've got to have a team around you that has passion for their area and expertise. And you've got to give them that seat and voice at the table. So the other thing I really believe in is young CEOs joining, whether it's on YPO or, like McKay forums like we have here in Canada, entrepreneurial forums, where you're talking to other experts, you're getting some experts brought in and getting that advice. And you're getting also some feedback and coaching from that peer coaching situation, and professional groups where you're getting industry expertise as well. It's like you've got to remain a learner in these roles and be coachable. That's so important.
And I think to plus on that, I think being a little picky about where the money comes from as well. I mean, I think that source, it's not just money. I think it's also going to be someone who, whether you want it or not, is going to be vested in your business. So it should be someone who you can work with and learn from. And I'll throw this. There's if we don't want to name names, they begin with an I and they end with an Eno, and they do bespoke men's clothing online.
Wouldn't know who that'd be.
I don't. I'm just hypothetically, but
yeah.
I remember the founders. They were fantastic, and the quality of their clothing was outstanding in what they had. And then flash forward a few years, the quality was just way down. And the model was all about opening up as many these so-called showrooms that were really bad retail environments as quickly as possible. And I don't want to throw anyone under the bus, but I know on the investor side, it wasn't necessarily people who got men's fashion. It was forget the background. There was some retail in there, but it was more fast-moving consumer product. And something went wrong there. I know they're still big and everything, but it didn't go where it could have gone, in my opinion. But I know that pressure from those investors and their desire to exit at a point where they wanted to exit, come hell or high water, started to drive a lot of the decision making and culture.
I think what Christine's, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Christine, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think what you said around, there is this point where as a founder, you've been everything, you've done everything, it's your baby, you've put your blood, sweat, and tears into it. And you get to that point where you have to be able to get help and be open-minded and understand that you don't have to have all the answers, you don't have to know it all. And I think often what happens is you get people that get to that point and they can't sidestep or recognize that they need the help or that they need to align with other people or mentors or just other business people in their sphere. And you often find then they get sort of bottlenecked. And I've seen it here with one particular footwear brand, a smaller one that's well known, where they have this incredibly gregarious founder and everyone has been following the brand, but people come and go, they try and bring in new ideas, they're not open to it. It's like this constant shift. And I could tell you 3 or 4 of my friends that I know who have kind of gone through that. And it ultimately comes back to, well, he owns the company, it's his decision. We could try and give him all the insight, all the data, all the whatever, and he's still not going to budge because in his mind, this is what he wants it to be. And he's lost touch with what it could be. And so it becomes really frustrating, I think, for a lot of the people that work in the organization to be with a leader that's not open-minded to, moving the business forward or to stepping aside and letting people take that on. And I think Phil Knight was a great example. He got the business to a point and he recognized he was an accountant and he needed to step to the side and let the experts come in and take it to where it's gone. But it's a challenge. I mean, you've worked with several businesses which have been founder-led, and I'm sure you've encountered, some challenges along the way in working with these founders and getting to the point where they scale and their openness or willingness to move forward with that. And they're 2 great success stories. I'm sure there's tons of others that David's mentioned that haven't been able to do that.
Christine Day, can you give any examples maybe of?
I'm not trying to put her on the spot.
No, I totally know that. Yeah, you wouldn't want to do that.
I'll tell you a story about, conversations with like Howard Schultz, right? And Howard loved the whole bean side of the business and the roasting of the coffee. And, he really loved all aspects of it, from making coffee at home, and that, he saw coffee at home, coffee at work, and, this third place that we created as the business model. But the consumer was, of course, loving the coffee that we're saying. They wanted the food, the pastry. So what the consumer wanted was different from this vision that Howard had. And while he loved all the growth, the smell of the paninis and the fact that we had to change the espresso machines to something that wasn't giving people carpal tunnel syndrome and could produce a more consistent cup without training, but it wasn't the Italian La Marzocco, And so he really struggled with what's the brand and his image and versus what is it the consumer's responding to. And by the way, we're now a public company and Oren's promised everybody 25% top and bottom line growth for the next, 5 years. And I'm on the hook for delivering that, as part of the team here. And so are you. So, but letting go of his vision versus what the business model needed was tough. And it was a lot of tough conversations with him, especially like the one when we went to Barissimo versus La Marzocco. And, so the stores had to be operational in a way that they could handle going from what was like 400 customers a day to sometimes 900 customers a day. And it requires a different operating system. And yet, how do you keep the art, the feeling, the guest experience in doing that? And those were some of the toughest conversations we had, and being willing to let go. It's kind of like having a dream for your child. They're going to be a doctor and they want to be an architect. Right. So when they went to school, and so it takes a generous, big human as the founder who cares more about loving the child and who they are than their dream of what their child could be. And you have to have that perspective, because guess what? The consumer's on this journey with you. And it's like computer technology. When it first came out, we had word processors and spreadsheets and databases, right? Then people learned how to use it, and they created software and all these other things. Your consumer takes you on a journey with your product. And the best companies understand that journey. So when it's the founder's ego versus the consumer's journey, you've got to grow with the consumer in order to have a healthy company.
Yeah. That's it in a nutshell.
Christine, can you just, for us, just for a second, just remind me, when you went into Lululemon, roughly what revenues were they at? Because you were there through a big growth, but on day one, when you got brought in, obviously an expert leader coming in to start to take over from a founder, what stage was that?
So the company had been public about 7 months. So it was right around just under the 200 million mark. And then so we hit the $1 billion mark about 5 years, from that. It was about $1.6 billion when I left after 6 years.
And to your point, if someone's listening and they're maybe at the 90, 100 mil mark, but they're thinking about the future, I guess, what you're saying is start to anticipate a day where you may need to step aside into a visionary role and actually embrace that.
Well, and let the consumer be let the market take you where the opportunity is. The thing founders forget is that they actually saw the market insight that created the first step. So you've just got to keep doing that with the consumer. You watched consumers and you had an idea and you pulled it together. And that job never stops. Yeah. And when you get fixated on, I've solved it, this is what it looks like, guess what? That market is still moving. Yeah. And you've got to find a way to do it, but keep your culture, your values, so the why you do it, love and passion of coffee and bringing it to consumers' life, with values, and the supply chain doesn't change. What you do and how you do it will change. And so your job is to steward the change in a way that keeps those values and that highly engaged consumer.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think the consumer journey, and we've talked about it on other podcasts, just consumers don't just stay in one place, and you've got to follow them, and you're going to have people coming in and going out, and you're constantly looking forward to that. But they're the ones that are going to bring that incredible insight to you and a vision of something that you may not have ever thought of. And to your point, you might have started here and you'll end up here. But if you allow that organically to happen, incredible things can happen within a brand.
And my favorite story is the Apple story, where there weren't going to be any more than, I think, a couple of million people a year that would pay $500 for an Apple phone, right? Now, that was, that's the best storyline, because here you are creating a market, right? And the consumer is falling in love with a product. And everybody else is getting left behind because, to your point, Christine, they're stuck in making the phones the way they've always made them. Right? And
everybody told us nobody'd pay $3.50 for a cup of coffee. Everybody told me nobody's paying, $100 for a pair of yoga pants. So I could go down the journey list, and we forget that people love great products, and especially great products that allow them to personalize.
Yeah, absolutely.
But great products that have a quality underneath the story, the quality matches the story. And I think that's one of the big, especially if you start with quality, being able to maintain that as you scale production and scale sourcing and so on.
Yeah. Well, the storytell is a huge part of the building of the brand too. The story of the inception and where it goes, and that constant communication of that and the journey of that, because that's what consumers want to know. They want to know the why of, why did this start? What was the problem it was solving? Why are you taking me here? What's important to you as a brand? What's your founder stand for? Are you transparent enough to tell me that you've got the same values that I have as a consumer? And people see through it if you're fake and you don't, walk the walk.
I think that's the point, but I'm finding like the pendulum swung a bit, and we're getting maybe too many people starting with a story that sounds really cool, as opposed to making something cool and then telling a story about it. But that's crotchety old guy talking. Yeah. We're starting to come down to our, we could go on this, and there's a lot of gold coming out from our guests today, but maybe one one round the horn just on a wrap up in terms of your thoughts about the prospects for young brands going forward, and any last words, if there are some founders among the 8 people listening today.
What I would say is, growth is not linear either, right? And it comes, your best ability to create a hockey stick starts with building a strong base of knowing your product, your story, your brand, and your consumer. And so giving businesses time to incubate. What people forget about Lululemon was it existed, 7, 8 years before it became a phenomenon, right? And then the hockey stick occurred. So there was a lot of years of honing what that model looks like, and even with Starbucks, it was a private company of 5, 7 stores. Then it started Il Giornale. So there was time to build the desire, the story, to really know. And so the thing sometimes with taking money and these big growth expectations is everybody expects the hockey stick to go like this. And so my advice, not only for entrepreneurs, but for people investing in small companies, is let the desire, and the business model settle before you hit all the growth levers and have those expectations. And then you'll have a stronger base to capture market and grow from. So the pressure to grow too fast, too early. And I think a lot of founders' fears from bringing in experts or whatever is they see people start to go to replicate growth stories without necessarily honoring the art of the business model that's been created. And so it's this incumbent upon the money that comes in to understand that cycle. And that's what causes a lot of fear in founders and letting in experts, is because they're just going to try to do the last business here as opposed to what is the right strategy for this business. And so, that the art of that conversation, I think, is really important between investor and young company, and knowing when to hit the accelerate button, I think is really a key part of the conversation for young companies.
Thank you so much. It was incredible to have you on with us, and really enjoyed the conversation with you.
Always enjoy a conversation about retail.
Well, too, maybe post-pandemic, we'll be able to set up a studio where we have a nice lounge and we can actually make it a real wine chat instead of a metaphorical one. I don't want to cut anyone else off if they got any last thoughts, but Gary, you good?
Yeah, I just have a thought as I listened to Christine earlier, that some founders or some small business startups are about finding the gap in the market. And I think in some ways this might be a paralyzing moment. They find it, they exploit it, but they don't go beyond that. They haven't kind of got they haven't kept those skills that found that market. And perhaps there are other ones that go into a very crowded market and make a difference. And I suspect, and I don't know enough, but I suspect those ones have learned how to adapt, and they will continue that process of adaptation because that's just what they did. And I think that we talk about founders and small businesses as a homogenous group, and I suspect that you could break it down into a few factors where this one probably has a recipe. They probably just need a little bit of support. This one has a recipe, but it's a recipe for staying still. So that'd be my kind of summary of what I've heard today with Christine's help.
Yeah, I think it's the difference between it's finding like one product opportunity versus an insight into a market opportunity, and how you then it's that pattern recognition skill, right? And so I think in your example of the first, what that person has is a pattern recognition and a greater purpose, that things that now fit that purpose fit in the pattern and they can scale it, versus the other was maybe a one product kind of insight, but they didn't necessarily recognize the pattern of why that was, or their purpose isn't big enough to include a broader frame of things that you would build upon it. So like Howard shifting from I'm selling a cup of coffee to the third place, right? He recognized that he was in the people business serving coffee, not in just the coffee business. And so that sense of coffee in all its expressions, Howard saw right from the beginning, I could improve every way people get coffee, and I can improve every way I source coffee. I can improve every way I roast coffee. So he saw it on a broader scale of coffee is the medium that people connect over. So he's had a bigger purpose, a bigger pattern. So now more things can fit into that. Versus when, you know, somebody was just like, I'm doing a coffee shop that does this locally. It might be great locally, but it might not be scalable. It might not be relevant enough. It can't be adaptable enough over time.
But I came out of this, I think, really feeling even more enthusiastic post-pandemic for the landscape as we see a sort of a void in business for the consumer, especially with some beloved enterprises may not being around when we get out of all this. I'm feeling pretty good that the vacuum will start to fill itself, but not just fill it with stuff, but maybe with some really interesting concepts that are all TBD. We don't know who they're going to be yet. But I think if anyone was listening in on this that is in that journey, just knowing that the opportunity is there and taking for granted that there's a market, I think there was some really good nuggets today on what to watch out for and to really get through if you decide you want to scale. Some really good counsel around being open to the advice and picking the right funding at the right time and really being able to be malleable in your model and not, what was your line, Christine Day? It was love the child that you have and not as they grow and not necessarily decide what they're going to become. I think that was the best part of a lot of good points you were making today. As we wrap here, I'd like to say to anyone listening, if you do enjoy this, and of course you can find these on our website, thebusinessofretail.ca. If you don't want to miss any, they come out twice a month, once every 2 weeks. But if you don't want to miss any, subscribe on YouTube if you want to see our beautiful faces. And if you don't, find us on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you, Christine Day. And maybe we can have you back in future if you had a good time today.
I had a very good time.
Thanks, Craig Patterson of Retail Insider, Christine Cowan, our brand expert, Gary Newbury, our supply chain guy, and George Minikakis, our CEO in residence. And for me, who's all about customer strategy and customer centricity, this was a great one today. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, everyone.
You have been listening to the Business of Retail podcast, an unflinching strategic alternative to the conventional industry discourse. Thank you for joining us. For more information, please go to www.thebusinessofretail.ca.